This was an interesting timeline because from the beginning, this entire foundation, this partnership had issues. Now, I will start out by saying that I think it's wonderful that the Dallios have been successful in life and they have used their private foundations for good. And I think that they should continue to do so. But now we are dealing with a private-public partnership.
I think I remember back in February when the governor's office brought this before us, and we thought it was an interesting concept, and we were open to the idea. My first question to them was what committee was going to hear the issue. Is it going to be finance? Because finance at that point, when it was raised, still had the ability to propose bills and have a public hearing. And the response was, we're going to leave that up to you. And it was never raised, the bill never came forward, and all of a sudden, surprise, it's in the budget. That is not the way the process should have occurred, and so I'm very critical of the fact that this entity was born out of backroom budget negotiations as a full process. You know, I'm sympathetic to the fact that the partnership wants to be able to have open and frank dialogue in a private room. That can be accomplished without decimating our freedom of information laws. And so I think had we all been in the room to have that conversation, there might have been a better result in this. And this gets back to my point of time and again we continue to see an erosion of process. This is why we have a public hearing process. This is why bills need to get a public hearing. This is why the public needs to be able to respond to those bills, and then they have a vote through the assembly. And we are seeing that less and less.
Because we've got both the donations that are being provided forward by the Dallio Foundation, plus their fundraising efforts from the private sector, but then there's also the public money. And right now, under the information that was provided in this creation of this organization within the state, there is no subjection to the Freedom of Information Act and transparency to how that money is being spent.
This started out last April with conversations about using surplus to fund the $100 million a year. Now, we all know that we are facing a $3 billion deficit in this biennium. Then the money was actually kind of diverted before it went in, so that they claimed that didn't count, so they didn't have to go up against a spending cap to put the money in, to allocate that money. Then we found out about the ethics and FOI exemptions for the board, and we, as elected officials, had serious concerns. We mentioned that. It didn't change.
Some analogies when we look at the state receiving federal money, there's always conditions on accepting that money. And there's no different with any public money. There are always conditions that are attached to how that money is spent. And one of the biggest things is that the public has access to know how their taxpayer money is being spent. There's transparency. There's an ability for the public to have input to that process if they have concerns about it.
So I sent a letter to the Attorney General asking for an opinion on what conflict that might be. As elected officials, we take an oath to give information to our constituents, and then we believe that that was a conflict. Because now the 5 elected officials sit on a board, and then we're not supposed to be subject to FOI. I mean, it just didn't make sense to even an average person that heard it. He thankfully agreed with us and said the 5 elected officials must follow and abide by the FOI laws, but the majority of the board does not have to. Now, let me say this. I understand, coming from the private sector, that they are not subject to these kind of laws we are in the public sector. I understand that. I understand that would be a difficult thing to now move into another sector and realize that things that you say or writings you have are now public, subject to public information. I understand it's difficult, but it's necessary. I don't have a problem with them coming in and believing that. My problem is nobody stopped them. Nobody stopped them.
Just recently, we saw 2 articles written that talked about the way the funding sources were being structured, where the state of Connecticut will be creating a sort of permanent intercept where the money that is being, tax dollars that is being sent to this corporation would not be an appropriation, but would rather be a direct transfer outside of the budget in which it falls outside the spending cap. That in and of itself lacks a level of transparency, but it begs the question of, is this a public-private partnership or is this a grant to a private entity?
Other prominent similar philanthropic organizations around the country. And two that come to mind that focused a lot on education are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Andre Agassi, who started a school in Las Vegas. And in both those cases, they chose to use only their own money. But if you look at the transparency that they provide and the information they provide to the public on their web pages, you have great knowledge of exactly how all the money is being spent, what they're doing, the interactions that they have. And so I think that's the model for what we should expect. And I remind you, in that case, they're using their own money.
We now most recently have seen communication organizations being hired to speak on behalf of this corporation, yet the very board members that were appointed to oversee this corporation have no knowledge of any contract or authorization for a hiring that has taken place. To date, we don't have an executive director hired, so there is nobody manning the day-to-day operations of this corporation. The problem with these two issues that have just cropped up only continues to exacerbate the issue of transparency. And I am pleased that the GAE committee has raised this bill to begin this discussion, because we never had a public hearing on this whole structure to begin with in order to be able to have a dialogue of how this looks.
To Representative Candelora's point, we are always willing to sit down and discuss anything and everything. We may not agree in the end, but we oftentimes find solutions to problems we have, and we work them through, oftentimes. But that didn't happen. We expressed this concern before the bill was called, before the budget was called. Then we went through the Attorney General, then we set up time, the first meeting is in September. I don't think this is that complicated. I really don't. If you are using taxpayer dollars, the taxpayers deserve to know what you're doing. There are a lot of complicated things in this building, and we deal with them often. This is not one of them.